Episode 29, Fishing for Trouble. A fishing trip is a relaxing pastime for many. But for a group of 3 friends, it was a fishing trip that they will never forget. Ian, Ken, and Tim had been preparing for their first ever overnight adventure for the past few weeks. And as fishing enthusiasts, who had only experienced day fishing by the lakeside, they were excitedly anticipating what was about to come. They thoroughly packed their gear, food to barbecue on the boat, snacks and board games to fill their spare time. Although they were overly prepared and ready for the trip, what they were about to experience that night was something they never expected. It was a Friday evening, and right after they ended their work, the 3 friends left their respective offices, rushed home to grab their bags, and drove to the dock to depart for their trip. Their boat was not too big, just enough for a front outdoor space for them to place their rods and an area for them to sit back on their foldable chairs and place their drinks on their mini tables. There was also space left for them to set up a small barbecue area as well. Behind the outdoor space was a short flight of stairs that goes down to an indoor area with an L-shaped couch and an empty area in the center to place their sleeping bags. From the indoor space, they could clearly see the outdoor area in front of them through the glass windows. And as Ian had a boat license, they didn't need a boat captain for the overnight trip. So, once they have brought in all their things, the 3 friends drove out to the open sea. They enjoyed the cool night breeze, and once they chose a spot, they stopped their boat, appreciated their peaceful surroundings before eventually beginning to set up their fishing gear and begin barbecuing. As they barbecued, they sat there and chatted. Ian then said, "Hey guys, later on when we're about to sleep and hear footsteps on the roof, just ignore it. I heard stories that it happens often as we are guests of the sea, and the spirits here are just conducting their rounds." In a sarcastic tone, Ken replied, "Sure, while they're at it, why don't they just sleep on the boat with us? They can check us out even closer." Slightly shaking his head after hearing Ken's response, Ian then said, "And one more thing. I heard that while we're out here, we must keep our sarcastic thoughts to ourselves. I mean, wouldn't you be pissed off if someone came to your home and begins challenging you?" replied Ian. "Relax, man. I'm sure they wouldn't mind having some company, seeing how quiet and boring it is out at sea. You hear that, spirits? Stomp harder on our boat's roof if you're bored. We can play with you," shouted Ken while looking up at the sky. "What's wrong with you, man? We're here to fish and enjoy ourselves and not create trouble," said Tim. Okay, I'll keep my voice down. Don't be too uptight, guys. Relax. We're here to lay back and let our hair down. The work week has been stressful enough," said Ken. The 3 friends continued fishing, and after a quiet few hours without any catch, they decided to take turns to sleep while one person at a time watches over the fishing rods, hoping that they will soon make their great catch. It was 2 a.m., and Ian woke Ken up for his turn to watch over the rods. Ken got up and headed to the front of the boat where they placed their rods, while Tim was sound asleep indoors as Ian joined him shortly after. Sat there alone and still feeling sleepy, Ken also began to feel bored at not getting any catch. After a short battle trying to stay awake, Ken eventually leaned back on his chair in front of the rods and fell asleep. Just as he dozed off, Ken heard his name whispered from afar. Ken woke up and looked around, but it was pitch dark and he couldn't see anything. As Ken thought that he was just hearing things, he tried to fall back to sleep. But suddenly, one of the rods began shaking, which indicated that the rod had caught a fish. This woke Ken up in excitement, and he immediately got up to reel the fish in. Ken briefly thought about calling his friends for help, but decided not to do so as he wanted to proudly show his sole effort in bringing in a good catch. but the harder he tried, the stronger he felt the pull. Then, as Ken struggled, the fish's resistance stopped. Ken continued to reel it in, and eventually the shape of what he caught began to surface. Just when he thought it was a big fish for him to brag to his friends about, Ken froze when he saw what seemed like a human head beginning to surface. With long black hair and pale forehead slowly ascending, the figure's eyes began to creep out of the waters. The eyes were staring right at Ken, which made him fall backwards on his foldable chair and let go of his rod. Ken then fell on the deck while still facing towards the direction of his catch. His eyes blinked, and just as his eyes reopened, Ken no longer saw anything there. His rod that he used earlier tumbled towards the mini table beside him, and as he was unsure whether what had happened earlier was real, Ken didn't wake his friends up. He got up and continued his shift duties. Now wide awake, Ken readjusted the rod that fell down and sat in front of it again. Ken kept on thinking about what had happened, and as he was staring blankly out at the pitch-dark sea, he felt the boat hit something on its right, and the boat stopped moving. Ken shone his flashlights on it and realized that his boat had drifted toward a small piece of land. Ken saw that it was an empty land, which was only made up of bushes and swamps. To see the other parts of it, Ken gradually panned his torchlights toward the right. As he was panning the light, Ken's heart raced in an instant when he suddenly saw a lady in white dress standing at a distance. Partially hidden behind one of the bushes, the lady was smiling right at Ken. And from what he recalled earlier, it was the same lady as the one he caught on the rod. That was when Ken realized that what he had experienced earlier was not his imagination. He was now afraid that the sighting was merely a prequel to more experiences, knowing what he had offensively said earlier on. As he was frozen still, the lady's smile lingered as she slowly floated towards Ken. Ken knew that he was in trouble, but his extreme fear prevented him from screaming out for his friends. Hoping that it was still his imagination, Ken looked down and slapped his face a couple of times. To his brief relief, Ken looked back up and the lady was no longer there. But just as he was about to let out a sigh of calmness, Ken heard footsteps on top of the roof. It was the same lady again, but this time she no longer just smiled. The lady laughed hysterically while staring piercingly at Ken. Ken could see his friends through the glass window, which sat right beneath the roof where the lady was standing. But it seemed like his friends were not hearing any of the hysterical laughter. They didn't move an inch from the loud sounds, even though the lady was now jumping up and down on the roof, which added to the already frightening sounds. Goosebumps ran up his neck and forearms when Ken suddenly saw the lady's laughter stop in an instant and stared at him with intense rage, as though she was seeking vengeance from Ken's earlier challenge. As the lady slowly took steps towards Ken again, suddenly, Tim's phone alarm at the sleeping area sounded off. Ken gazed his eyes downwards and saw both Tim and Ian were woken up in shock from the loud alarm sound. Still panting from fear, Ken then gazed upwards again and noticed that the lady was no longer on the boat's roof. Ian and Tim, who just woke up, could see Ken through the window and saw him frozen with his face as pale as a ghost. Seeing that Ken didn't look like his usual overly confident self, Ian and Tim both walked out and asked Ken about what had happened. Ken seemed lost and could hardly explain what he had experienced earlier. All Ken could do then was to tell them, "I'm sorry for what I said just now. I'm sorry," as tears began to flow from the intensely horrifying encounter that he just had. Ian and Tim sat beside Ken for the next couple of hours trying to calm him down, although they weren't exactly sure what Ken had gone through. None of them slept again, as Ian and Tim barbecued some food to make Ken feel better. The three friends just chatted about other matters, and of course, it was mostly Ian and Tim who were doing the chatting. Ken was unlike his usual vocal self and mostly listened to the conversations. As the morning sun began, they turned their boat back to shore without a catch. Ken was in a less traumatic state now, and began sharing every detail of his horror story. Ian and Tim couldn't believe the extent of the haunting that Ken experienced, as it sounded too extreme to them. But after giving it a second thought, they remembered how Ken went overboard with his rude shoutings at the sea and knew that it was a lesson Ken needed anyway. The story lived on in the conversations they had in years that followed. Whenever they would hang out, they would always rekindle the experience. It became a story for conversation that would end up with Ken being made fun of for looking ever so pale that night. And although Ken is more relaxed now about sharing the incident, he never went for an overnight fishing trip ever again. Every time he would consider doing so, he would always be reminded of every bit of his haunting experience. The lady's hysterical laughter, her vengeful eyes, and of course, her boat-stomping action that eventually drove Ken to tears.